The gun was already pressed against Grant Archer's temple when Virginia Garner made the worst mistake of her life and screamed his name. She had not meant to. She had spent the better part of 6 months telling herself that Grant Archer meant nothing to her, that he was merely her employer, that the quiet way he left a plate of warm food outside her room on cold nights was a practical gesture and nothing more, that the calloused hand he had extended to her that first day in Laramie had been simple Western courtesy, and certainly not the beginning of anything she had ever wanted or feared. She had told herself all of those things with the conviction of a woman who had crossed half a continent specifically to avoid needing anyone. And then she had screamed his name into the dusty Wyoming air and given herself away completely. Dillard Crane, who held the gun, heard it. His thin mouth curled into something that was not quite a smile. He was a man who trafficked in other people's vulnerabilities the way some men trafficked in cattle, and he had just spotted one he had not expected to find. "Well now," Dillard said softly, turning his watery pale eyes toward Virginia where she stood frozen at the corner of the mercantile. "Seems like I got something you want back." Grant's jaw was set like stone. There was a long gash across his left cheekbone from where Dillard's man had caught him off guard behind the livery, and blood had dried in a dark line down toward his chin. He was looking directly at Virginia with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something between fury and a desperate, silent plea. The plea said, "Run." She understood it perfectly and had absolutely no intention of obeying it. "Let him go," Virginia said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect, given that her heart had crawled entirely into her throat. "Whatever your business is with him, it doesn't involve me. Let him go and I'll walk away and nobody in this town will hear a word from me." Dillard laughed, a short, wet sound. "Oh, I don't think that's true anymore, Miss Garner. I think it involves you plenty." And then she understood what was about to happen and why, and how 6 months of careful, deliberate distance had collapsed into this single terrible moment on a Tuesday afternoon in September of 1883. She had not started her story here. She had started it 1,000 miles east, in a city that had chewed her down to nothing and spit her out still standing. Virginia Garner had grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a house that smelled of lye soap and disappointment. Her father had been a bookkeeper with neat hands and a drinking problem that grew neater as his hands grew less steady. And her mother had died of fever when Virginia was 11, leaving her to manage the household, the ledgers, and her father's increasingly creative relationship with the truth. By the time Virginia was 20, she could balance accounts in her sleep, negotiate with creditors in 3 different tones depending on how much she needed from them, and predict the precise moment a man's pride was about to curdle into something uglier. These were not the skills a woman in 1883 was supposed to want. They were, however, the skills she had. When her father died of a stroke at his own desk on a cold February morning, Virginia was 24 years old and possessed of exactly nothing. No savings, no family, no husband, no prospects in a city where every door she knocked on led to the same conversation. "We admire your competency, Miss Garner, but the position requires a man. We're sure you understand." She understood perfectly. She also understood that the same advertisement that kept appearing in the back pages of the Cincinnati Commercial Gazette was not going to disappear simply because she had decided to ignore it. Wanted, bookkeeper and general ledger manager for growing cattle and supply operation, Laramie, Wyoming Territory. Experience required. Salary, $35 per month. Apply in writing to G. Archer, Archer Cattle Co., Laramie. WT. $35 a month was more than she had ever been offered in Cincinnati. Wyoming Territory was somewhere she had never considered going. Virginia read the advertisement 3 times, told herself she was not desperate enough to uproot herself for a cattle operation at the edge of civilization, and then sat down and wrote the most precise, professional letter of application she had ever composed. She did not mention that she was a woman. The advertisement had not specified. She signed it V. Garner and waited. G. Archer wrote back within 2 weeks. The letter was brief and businesslike. It said her references were acceptable, her experience was more than sufficient, the position was hers if she still wanted it, and she could expect accommodations provided as part of her compensation. He would meet her at the Laramie depot upon arrival. He did not mention salary negotiation. He did not ask a single personal question. Virginia appreciated both of those things enormously. She spent her last $20 on a train ticket and packed everything she owned into a single trunk. The Union Pacific Railroad brought her into Laramie on a blinding bright morning in the second week of March, 1883. The cold was a different creature out here than it was in Ohio, drier and sharper and somehow more honest about itself, and Virginia stepped off the train platform into it with her spine perfectly straight, and her face arranged into the expression that had carried her through every difficult moment of the last several years. Composed, capable, and entirely closed to sentiment. Grant Archer was leaning against a post at the far end of the platform. She knew it was him before he even looked up, in the way you sometimes know things about people before they give you any reason to. He was tall in the particular unhurried way of men who had spent years outdoors, with dark hair showing beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a working coat that had clearly been chosen for function rather than impression. He was reading something, a folded paper, and when the crowd from the train thinned and Virginia was the only one left standing alone with a trunk, he looked up and read the situation in approximately 2 seconds. He came forward and extended his hand. "Grant Archer," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, even and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not feel the need to fill silence. "Miss Garner, I take it." "Virginia Garner," she said, shaking his hand firmly. She watched his face for the flicker she had learned to expect from men, the adjustment period when they realized that V. Garner was a woman and recalibrated their enthusiasm downward accordingly. The flicker did not come. "Good," Grant said simply. "You made good time. The roads between here and the depot can be rough this time of year. Wagons out front." He reached for her trunk. "I can manage it," Virginia said. The words came out sharper than she intended, habit and defensiveness firing simultaneously. Grant looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, more the way a person looks when they are filing information away for later use. "All right," he said, and walked ahead to hold the wagon door instead. She managed the trunk herself and did not thank him for not making an issue of it. He did not appear to require thanks. The drive out to Archer Cattle Company took 40 minutes along a road that wound through country so wide and open it made Virginia's chest feel strange, too much sky pressing down on her sense of where she fit in the world. Grant drove without unnecessary commentary. He pointed out the general store she could use for personal supplies, the post office, the name of the doctor in town should she need one, and the particular stretch of fence that marked the edge of his property. He spoke about all of these things in the same tone, factual and without inflection, and Virginia found herself oddly grateful for it. She had half expected to spend this drive managing someone's disappointment about her gender. Instead, she was being treated like a person who had been hired for a job, which was all she had ever wanted and almost never received. The ranch itself was larger than she had imagined. The main house was a solid 2-story timber structure with a covered porch, and the outbuildings included a bunkhouse, a barn, 2 corrals, and a small separate structure that Grant indicated was the office where she would be working. The accommodation she had been promised turned out to be a room on the 2nd floor of the main house, modest but private, with a good window that faced east. "You'll share meals with the household," Grant said, showing her the room. "My housekeeper Ruth is here weekdays. Hands eat in the bunkhouse. I try not to let the business interfere with reasonable hours, but I'll be honest with you, Miss Garner, spring and fall get complicated. I'll expect you to keep the books current and flag anything unusual the same day you find it. If there's ever something you can't account for, I'd rather know immediately than have it tidied up and buried." "That's my preference as well," Virginia said. He nodded once, as if that settled something, and showed her the office. The office was the most orderly workspace she had ever occupied. The ledgers were current and clearly maintained by someone who knew what they were doing, though Grant explained that the previous bookkeeper, an older man named Fletcher, had retired to New Mexico for his health and left the accounts in reasonable condition but 6 weeks behind. Virginia sat down at the desk, opened the most recent ledger, and began reading. Grant left her to it without asking if she needed anything, which was either very rude or very respectful, and she was prepared to decide which one later. By the end of the first week, she had caught the accounts up to current. She had also found a discrepancy. It was not a large one, not the kind that announced itself. It was the kind that hid in the seams between columns, a pattern of small, irregular withdrawals that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested that someone had been helping themselves to operating funds over a period of at least 8 months. Virginia marked every instance with a small, neat notation and put the ledger on Grant's desk with a note that said, "I've flagged 11 entries that appear irregular. The pattern suggests systematic, not accidental. I'd like to discuss before we go further." Grant came to find her in the office that same evening. He read her notations in silence. His expression did not change significantly, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted in a way Virginia had already learned to read as controlled anger. "Fletcher," he said finally. "Almost certainly," Virginia said, "though I can't prove intent from ledger entries alone. If you have receipts from the corresponding periods, I could cross-reference." "There's a box of receipts in the back room," Grant said. "I'll get it." He brought her the box. They sat on opposite sides of the desk for the next 2 hours going through receipts, while the ranch went quiet around them, and the oil lamp between them burned lower. Virginia worked methodically, pulling each receipt and matching it against her flagged entries, and Grant watched her work with an attentiveness that had nothing predatory in it. He was watching the way you watch someone who knows what they are doing, with a kind of steady, honest respect that Virginia had rarely encountered from men who were her employers. At the end of the 2 hours, she had confirmed 8 of the 11 discrepancies beyond argument. She pushed the relevant receipts into a neat pile and said, "What do you want to do with this? What do you recommend?" Grant said. No one had ever asked her that before. She kept her face neutral. "The total is approximately $340 over 8 months. Fletcher is in New Mexico. Pursuing him legally would cost more than you'd recover. But you should have this documented in case he surfaces elsewhere, and you should adjust your accounts reconciliation process going forward so it can't happen again as easily. I'd suggest a weekly cross-check between cash on hand and ledger entries. I can build that into my routine." "Do it," Grant said. He gathered the receipts she had set aside and stood up. "Good work, Miss Garner." He said it the way he said everything, plainly and without embellishment, and for reasons Virginia could not have explained, those 2 plain words meant more than any amount of enthusiastic praise she had received in Cincinnati. She told herself it was simply professional satisfaction, a job recognized for what it was. She was already beginning to lie to herself, though she would not recognize it for some time yet. Ruth Sable, the housekeeper, was a Cheyenne-born woman of 50 with silver threading through her black hair, and the manner of someone who had spent decades watching the world arrange and rearrange itself around her. She appeared in Virginia's room doorway on the second morning with a cup of coffee and no particular explanation, set it on the bedside table, and left. When Virginia came downstairs, Ruth was already at the stove and the kitchen smelled of cornbread and salt pork. They regarded each other across the kitchen in a silence that was not unfriendly. "You're the new bookkeeper," Ruth said. "Yes," Virginia said. Ruth nodded. "Sit down." Virginia sat down. Ruth put a plate in front of her and sat across from her with her own coffee and said, with the comfortable directness of someone who had long since stopped pretending, "He's a decent man. Better than most. He'll work you hard, but he won't take credit for what you do, and he won't mistake good work for an invitation to anything else. Had to let a hand go last summer for bothering one of the women from town who came to help with the kitchen during roundup. Sent him off the property same day. Virginia absorbed this. I appreciate knowing that, she said. You don't trust easy, Ruth observed. No, Virginia said. Ruth nodded again, seemingly approving of the directness. Good, she said. Shouldn't, but there are degrees. Virginia thought about this while she ate her cornbread. She did not ask Ruth to elaborate. She had a feeling the elaboration was going to happen whether she asked for it or not, over time and in pieces, the way Ruth seemed to dispense most things. She was right. Over the weeks that followed, Ruth told her things in small installments without ever making it feel like she was being told anything at all. She learned that Grant had come to Wyoming from Colorado 10 years ago with 4 horses, a small inheritance, and a specific vision of what he wanted to build. That he had built it largely alone through seasons that had killed other men's operations, and a cattle market that fluctuated with the casual cruelty of something that could not be argued with. That he had been engaged once, briefly, to a woman in Laramie, and that the woman had decided the ranch was too remote and the life too hard and gone back east to marry a merchant, which Grant had apparently taken with the same stoic equanimity he brought to everything else, though Ruth's tone, when she mentioned it, suggested she thought this particular equanimity had come at some cost. Virginia filed all of this away and told herself she was simply building a professional understanding of her employer's history. Context was important in any working relationship. This was entirely rational. Spring in Wyoming was nothing like spring in Ohio. It arrived violently and in stages, with false warmth followed by fresh cold, followed by mud so thick it pulled boots off men's feet, and turned the corrals into a kind of ground-level chaos that the hands navigated with a practiced resignation Virginia found almost admirable. The cattle operation went into its full seasonal intensity, which meant Grant was often away from the house before dawn and back after dark, and the paperwork he brought her grew heavier each week. Purchase orders for feed, payroll for seasonal hands, contracts with 2 different buyers in Cheyenne, insurance correspondence, tax records for the territory assessor. Virginia managed all of it with the efficiency she brought to everything and the growing, private satisfaction of someone who had finally found a problem large enough to be genuinely interesting. She began leaving summaries on Grant's desk in the evenings, brief and clear. He began leaving responses in the mornings, equally brief. It was the most functional working relationship she had ever had, and it had the particular intimacy of 2 people who communicated well without wasting each other's time. One evening in late April, she came back to the house after a long day to find that the small stove in the office had gone cold and that someone had left a plate of food on the table outside her room door. The plate had a cloth over it to keep it warm, and underneath was a portion of whatever Ruth had made for supper: beans, salt pork, and a piece of bread. Virginia stood in the hallway and looked at the plate for longer than was probably warranted. She could not immediately identify the feeling the plate produced in her, which was unsettling, because she had always been very good at identifying her own reactions and acting accordingly. After a moment she picked it up and took it inside and ate it and told herself it was Ruth's doing. The second time it happened, she noticed that Ruth had already been gone for 2 hours by the time she came back to the house. She did not mention it. Grant did not mention it. The plates continued to appear on her bad days, which was somehow the most disorienting thing of all, because she had never told him which days were bad. He simply knew. The way he had apparently been quietly knowing things about her working hours and her coffee preferences, and the fact that she found the north window in the office easier on her eyes in the afternoon, moving the desk accordingly one day without comment, and the way he had, without any discussion, replaced the stiff-backed chair at her desk with one he had clearly brought up from the house at considerable inconvenience to himself. She began to feel the shape of his care the way you feel a current in still water, not visible on the surface but unmistakably present beneath it, moving things. She did not like it. Or rather, she liked it far too much, which amounted to the same problem. Virginia had come west specifically to build a life that did not require her to depend on another person's goodwill. Every difficult year in Cincinnati had reinforced the same lesson. Goodwill was conditional, care was transactional, and the moment you needed someone, you had handed them a piece of yourself that they could eventually use against you. She had not crossed 1,000 miles of continent to hand anyone anything. She had come to work, to be paid fairly for that work, and to stand on her own 2 feet in a place wide enough that no one's limitations would box her in. Those were the terms she had set for her own life, and they had served her, and she was not prepared to renegotiate them simply because a man left warm food outside her door. She threw herself into the work with renewed intensity, which was saying something given that her previous intensity had already impressed the 3 seasonal hands who occasionally needed to come to her with paperwork, and who had clearly expected her to be more of an ornament than an operator. She extended the ranch's bookkeeping into a proper double entry system, built a filing archive for all contracts and correspondence, identified a supplier in Cheyenne who was overcharging Grant by approximately 15% on grain orders, and renegotiated the contract by letter, saving the operation nearly $200 over the course of a season. She kept meticulous records, flagged every anomaly, and produced quarterly summaries that Grant read with the careful attention of a man who actually understood what he was reading. Their conversations grew longer in the evenings, from the brief exchanges over paperwork into something more sustained. Grant pulled up a second chair to her desk one night in May, and they spent an hour discussing a potential expansion into sheep grazing on the south pasture, something that several of the other large operations in the territory were considering. Virginia's analysis was that the initial investment was sound, but the market timing was poor given the current cattle prices and the likelihood of an oversupply problem developing by 1885. Grant listened to every word she said, asked 3 precise follow-up questions, and then said, "You're right, we'll hold off," as if her judgment were simply the natural conclusion of the conversation. She stayed up too late that night, not working, just sitting with the lamp low and the sound of the Wyoming wind against the window, trying to locate the boundary between professional respect and something she was not going to name. She could not find it anymore. That was the problem. In June, a man named Dillard Crane rode onto the property. Virginia was in the office when she heard horses in the yard and looked up to see 2 riders approaching the house, one of whom had the kind of stillness about him that she had learned in Cincinnati to recognize as deliberate, the way a man holds himself when he is accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in a room. She watched from the window without being seen. Grant came out onto the porch. She could not hear the conversation from the office, but she watched it the way she watched ledger entries, for pattern and for what was not being said. Grant's posture was closed, which she had never seen before. His arms came up and crossed in front of him at the chest, not aggressive but fully defensive. The man, Dillard Crane, said something that made Grant's jaw tighten visibly even at this distance. After perhaps 5 minutes, Grant said something final and the 2 riders left. Grant came into the office afterward. He sat down in the second chair and was quiet for a moment in a way that was different from his usual considered silences. This silence had something tight in it. "Who was that?" Virginia asked. "A man named Crane," Grant said. "He runs a loan and land operation out of Cheyenne. He's been buying up property from ranches that run into trouble and reselling at profit. He approached me 2 years ago about buying the south pasture. I declined. He came back to try again. He came back to tell me," Grant said carefully, "that he's now holding the note on the grain supplier in Cheyenne, the one you renegotiated last month." Virginia felt the cold clarity of understanding arrive before he finished the sentence. "He bought the debt from the supplier. He bought the whole business," Grant said, lock, stock, and the note on my new contract, which means he's now my supplier and he's going to reinstate the original pricing. He can't do that, Virginia said. The contract I renegotiated is binding. He says he intends to argue that Fletcher signed the original contract as my authorized representative, and that my new representative, Grant looked at her steadily, was not properly authorized in writing. Virginia sat back. The anger that moved through her was clean and familiar, the same anger she had felt every time a back door had been used against her in Cincinnati, the same cold fire she had learned to think with rather than burn with. He's wrong, she said. Your letter of employment to me explicitly authorizes me to conduct all business correspondence on behalf of Archer Cattle Company. I kept that letter. It predates his purchase of the supply business. He has no case. Grant looked at her for a long moment. You kept my letter. I keep everything, Virginia said flatly. Standard practice. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him, a small movement in the corner of his mouth that arrived and departed quickly, like a bird landing on a fence. All right, he said. Then we hold the contract. I'll write to the attorney in Cheyenne tonight, Virginia said. They wrote the letter together, Virginia composing and Grant providing the specific legal citations he knew from years of territorial business. And the collaboration had a new quality to it, a shared urgency that felt different from the careful professional distance she had been maintaining. When they were done, it was past 10 o'clock and the kitchen was dark and Ruth had been gone for hours, and Grant stood up from the desk and said, without making a particular thing of it, "There's cold chicken and bread in the kitchen. You should eat before you sleep." "I'm fine," Virginia said. "I know you are," Grant said. "There's still food in the kitchen." He went to bed. Virginia sat at the desk for another few minutes and then went to the kitchen and ate the cold chicken and bread, and experienced the profound irritation of someone whose defenses are eroding faster than they can be rebuilt. The attorney in Cheyenne confirmed within the week that the contract was enforceable. Dillard Crane withdrew his challenge without further correspondence, which Virginia found interesting. A man who retreated that quickly from a legal position he had supposedly been confident about was either a coward or a tactician, and nothing about Dillard Crane had suggested cowardice. He was waiting for a different angle. She was certain of it. The summer unfolded with the particular beauty and brutality of Wyoming summers, days so hot and bright they seemed to flatten the landscape, and evenings that turned the sky above the mountains into something so extravagant it felt almost embarrassing to look at directly. Virginia had not thought much about beauty before. In Cincinnati, beauty had been largely irrelevant to survival, and she had developed the habit of filtering it out in favor of more practical assessments. Out here, it was harder to filter. The country was too big and too insistent and too genuinely indifferent to whether you noticed it or not, which somehow made noticing it feel less like a weakness. She began taking a walk in the early evening after supper, along the fence line of the north pasture, ostensibly for the exercise. Grant began appearing at the far end of the same fence line, ostensibly doing a final check of the cattle before dark. They began walking the same direction at the same pace without ever discussing it. After 3 weeks of this, Virginia acknowledged privately that neither of them was operating ostensibly about anything. They talked on these walks, not about work, though work was the easiest language between them, but about other things. Grant had grown up in Colorado in a family of 5, the middle child and the only one who had stayed west. He spoke about his brothers with a dry fondness that suggested he missed them more than he would directly say. He had spent a year working on the railroad as a young man, before deciding the railroad was not where his particular combination of stubbornness and preference for open space would be best deployed. He had read more than Virginia expected, had a collection of books in the house that included several she had loved, and had opinions about them that were worth arguing with, which she found herself doing with increasing frequency and increasing enjoyment. He listened to her, in a way that most men did not. Not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually tracking what she said and responding to it, following a thought she had started to its conclusion, and occasionally extending it in a direction she had not seen, which was unusual and pleasurable in a way she was running out of patience for pretending to be indifferent to. She told him about Cincinnati, a little, about her father less, about the particular experience of being consistently underestimated, which she described in terms deliberately drained of self-pity, because she did not want his pity and never had, and which he listened to with the particular quality of attention she had come to recognize as the thing he did when something mattered to him. "You came out here alone," he said one evening, on the strength of a one-page advertisement in a Cincinnati newspaper. The advertisement offered fair pay for qualified work, Virginia said. That was more than Cincinnati was offering. Most women wouldn't have done it. Most women don't make the same calculations I make, Virginia said, and then, because honesty had a way of getting away from her in these conversations, I wasn't afraid of the work or the distance. I was afraid of arriving and having you tell me the position wasn't available after all, that it had been filled, that it was actually a man's job. Grant was quiet for a moment, looking out over the pasture where the last light was pooling gold along the ridgeline. "I almost wrote and asked if you were a woman," he said. "After your letter, I figured V could go either way. What stopped you?" "I decided it wasn't relevant," Grant said. "Your qualifications were relevant. Whether you could do the work was relevant. Everything else was your business." Virginia kept her eyes on the mountains and said nothing for a moment because there was nothing to say that would not give too much away, and she was still, even now, trying to protect some of the distance she had decided she needed. "Thank you for that," she said finally, very quietly. Grant nodded. They walked back to the house in silence, the kind that held things carefully without squeezing them too hard. The next day she caught herself humming while she worked through the payroll figures. She stopped immediately and stared at the ledger with genuine alarm. Things with Dillard Crane escalated in July. One of Grant's seasonal hands, a young man named Porter, came to the office with a story he had heard from a hand on a neighboring ranch. Dillard Crane had been quietly acquiring options on several parcels of land around the valley, including the water rights to a creek that ran through the eastern edge of Grant's grazing territory. If those water rights transferred to Crane's control, the summer grazing capacity of the ranch would be effectively cut in half. Virginia took this directly to Grant, who set down the fence staple he was working with and was silent for exactly 4 seconds before saying, "How long has he had those options?" "Porter's information suggests 3 months at least," Virginia said, "which means he's been pursuing this since around the time he came to make you sell the South Pasture." "He's not after the South Pasture," Grant said. "He's after the whole operation." "Yes," Virginia said. "Through attrition. Take the water rights, reduce your grazing capacity, wait for a bad cattle year and buy when you're stretched thin." The assessment was clean and certain, and Grant received it with the focused attention of someone making decisions rather than spinning into reaction. "What do I need to do to secure the water rights before he can exercise those options?" "I'll need to see the territorial land records," Virginia said. "I'll go to Laramie tomorrow." "I'll come with you," Grant said. "I can manage it," Virginia said, automatic and immediate. Grant looked at her steadily. "I know you can," he said. "I'd like to come anyway." She opened her mouth to argue and closed it again. The words had arrived differently than usual. He had not challenged her competence. He had said he wanted to be there. These were not the same thing, and she was tired enough of pretending they were that she found herself simply saying, "All right, we'll leave early." The drive to Laramie the next morning was the longest uninterrupted time she had spent alone with Grant outside the ranch, and the territory around them was showing off in the way it occasionally did. The sky an improbable shade of blue and the peaks beyond the town clear and white-hedged against it. Grant drove without the particular tense focus men often had when they were heading toward a problem, more with the quality of someone who had dealt with enough problems to know that arriving at them worked better when you were not already exhausted by anticipation. They went to the Territorial Land Office first. Virginia requested the relevant records while Grant waited, and she went through them with the same focused speed she brought to the ledgers, making notes in her small, precise hand. When she found what she was looking for, she put her pen down and said, "Crane filed the option on the water rights in March. The option expires in 30 days. If the option is not exercised, the rights revert to an open status and you can file for them directly." "Can he exercise it before 30 days?" Grant asked. "He would need the full purchase amount in certified funds deposited with the Territorial Land Office. That's not a trivial sum for water rights of this size." She turned over the page. "The deposit required is $420. Grant was quiet for a moment. "That's manageable. It's also preemptible," Virginia said. "If you file a competing claim before his option is exercised and make the full deposit, the original option becomes legally contested. It would go before the territorial judge, which takes time, but it would delay Crane from having any access to those rights until the case is resolved." "How long would that delay him?" 6 months minimum. "Possibly longer if we argue the original option was obtained through misrepresentation of the land classification, which I believe it was, based on the acreage recorded here." She showed him the relevant entry. "He's filed it as agricultural land. The creek and its banks are grazing territory under the 1880 Territorial Land Act. Different category, different filing procedure. His option may be technically invalid." Grant looked at the entry and then at Virginia with an expression she had not seen before and could not immediately categorize. It was not admiration exactly, though that was part of it. It was something closer to wonder, the way you might look at something extraordinary that you had not expected to find in the particular drawer you opened. "Virginia," he said. He had used her first name exactly twice before. "Has anyone ever told you that you are remarkable?" The word landed somewhere between her sternum and her spine and stayed there. She arranged her face carefully and said, "People have occasionally mentioned that my bookkeeping is thorough." He almost smiled again, wider than usual. "That wasn't what I meant." She looked back at the land records because it was that or do something she could not take back. "We should file the competing claim today," she said, "before Crane hears we've been to the land office." They filed the claim. The clerk at the land office took their deposit and their documentation and issued a receipt, and Virginia folded the receipt into the leather case she carried for important documents and kept her face entirely professional as they walked back to where Grant had tied the horses. She was winning a legal and business battle against a man who had intended to dismantle everything Grant had spent a decade building, and she felt the fierce pleasure of it in her blood. And underneath the pleasure was something else she was less comfortable with, the awareness that she cared about this, not only because the work was satisfying, but because what was being protected mattered to her personally. Grant's operation, Grant's land, Grant's decade of difficult, stubborn, honest work. She cared about all of it the way you care about things that have quietly become yours, which they had not, which they were not, and which she had precisely no right to feel. They had dinner at a small restaurant in Laramie before driving back, the first time they had eaten together anywhere other than the ranch. The restaurant was simple, pine tables and oil lamps, but the food was good, and the strangeness of sitting across from Grant in a public space rather than across a desk gave the meal a quality Virginia tried not to examine too closely. Grant ordered without fussing and ate without performing, talked about a book he had been reading about the geological formation of the Rockies, and asked her what she had been reading lately with the genuine interest of someone who actually wanted to know. She told him about a novel she had found in the town lending library. They argued pleasantly about the ending for 20 minutes. The lamp on the table between them burned steadily, and outside the window the Wyoming evening had gone a deep blue, and Virginia sat in the middle of it and let herself, for just this one meal, Stop calculating the distance she was supposed to be maintaining. Riding back to the ranch in the dark, the stars overhead in their extravagant Wyoming density, Grant said, "I know you came west to work." Virginia's hands tightened slightly on the seat edge. "Yes," she said. "I want you to know," Grant said carefully in the measured way he had of approaching things that mattered, "that whatever you came west for, you're welcome to stay as long as you want. The position is yours indefinitely. That's not contingent on anything." It was a careful thing to say. It was the most careful and least pressuring thing a man in his position could have said to her in that moment, and she understood exactly what he was doing and felt it break something open in her that she had been keeping very deliberately locked. "I appreciate that," she said, too quietly, but it was the best she could manage. He did not push it further. He never pushed anything further. That was the most disarming thing about him, that he consistently stopped precisely at the boundary of her comfort and waited there without complaint, as if he had all the time in the world and was genuinely content to spend it in the vicinity of whatever she was willing to offer. They arrived back at the ranch near midnight, and Grant helped her down from the wagon without making it significant, and she let him, and they stood for a moment in the yard under all those stars with the sounds of the horses settling and the wind moving through the grass, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him without effort. She didn't, but she wanted to, and that wanting was no longer something she could pretend away. She went inside and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a very long time. Dillard Crane's reaction to the competing claim came faster than she had expected. Within 10 days of their Laramie filing, he appeared in town again, and this time he went not to the ranch but to 3 of Grant's neighboring property owners, men he had apparently been cultivating separately, and made them offers that were designed to isolate Grant's operation from the cooperative grazing agreements that were part of how several of the ranches in the valley managed their summer territory. Porter brought this intelligence, and Virginia brought it to Grant, and the 3 of them, Virginia, Grant, and Porter, who had more practical knowledge of the valley's social geography than either of them, sat in the office and mapped what Crane was doing. It was a coordinated squeeze: water rights, supplier pricing, and now grazing cooperation agreements, individually manageable, together a slow-motion suffocation. "He's been planning this for a long time," Grant said. "He's patient," Virginia agreed. "And he's good at it. He's done this before. I wrote to the attorney after the first visit and asked for any known history on Crane's operations. The attorney's reply came 2 days ago." She opened her desk drawer and produced the letter. "He's done this exact pattern to 3 other operations in the territory over the past 4 years. One of those ranchers ended up selling at a significant loss. The other 2 held on, but it took them years." "How did they hold on?" Grant asked. "One of them had a senator's nephew as a business partner, which gave him political leverage Crane couldn't fight," Virginia said. "The other one found evidence of a fraudulent filing in Crane's original land office documentation and used it to have his operating license in the territory reviewed." Grant and Porter were both looking at her. "I've already sent to the territorial land office for the full documentation on Crane's other filings," Virginia said. "The clerk mentioned when we were there last week that Crane's legal work is handled by only one attorney in Cheyenne, a man named Sykes. That kind of consistency usually means the same patterns appear in different filings. If Crane misrepresented the land classification on our water rights option, there's a reasonable probability he's done it elsewhere." "You're building a case against him," Grant said slowly. "I'm building documentation," Virginia said. "What happens with it is a different question, but I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it." Grant looked at her for a long moment. "When did you become a legal strategist?" he said. There was something in his voice that was warm in a way that had nothing to do with professionalism. "I've always been one," Virginia said. "I've just had better circumstances to apply it in." That evening, she came back to the house to find a book left on the small table outside her room, not food this time, a book she had mentioned in passing 2 weeks ago as one she had not been able to find in the town lending library. It was a fair copy, not new but well kept, and inside the front cover in Grant's straightforward hand was a single line, "In case you want a different kind of work for an evening." She sat down on the hallway floor with her back against the wall, and held the book in both hands, and felt the absolute futility of continuing to maintain that she was not falling in love with him. She got up off the floor, took the book into her room, and sat down at the small writing desk she kept there for personal correspondence. She did not write a letter. She sat for a long time looking at the wall. Then she thought, with the same clarity she brought to ledgers and land records and contract disputes, "I did not come west to need anyone. I came west because I was done being in a world that would not see me as I am. And Grant Archer sees me as I am. That is not the same thing as needing him. That is something I have never had before, and I am an idiot if I throw it away because I am afraid of it." She sat with this conclusion for several days. She was not a person who rushed decisions. The land records from Crane's other territorial filings arrived at the end of July, and Virginia spent 3 days going through them with the same methodical focus she had brought to Fletcher's fraudulent ledger entries 8 months ago. On the second day she found it. Not one misclassification, but 4, all following the same pattern as the one on Grant's water rights. All handled by the same attorney, Sykes, all filed within the same 18-month window. The pattern was not subtle once you knew what to look for. It was the pattern of someone who had found a reliable method and trusted in the volume of paperwork to protect it from scrutiny. She brought the documentation to Grant on a Thursday afternoon with the quiet certainty she had when the numbers were right. She laid it out on the desk in order, explained each instance, and watched him read through it with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered. "You can take this to the Territorial Land Office," she said. "Combined with our competing claim, it gives you grounds to request a review of all of Crane's territory filings. If that review is launched, every operation he's been running simultaneously gets complicated. He won't be able to press on any single property, including yours, without the review coming back to him." "He'll know it was us," Grant said. "Yes," Virginia said, "he'll be angry." "Are you worried about that?" She thought about it honestly. Not about his anger, about what he might do with it. He's practical, not emotional. His anger will be strategic. Grant nodded, reading through the documents again. Then he looked up at her and said, "Virginia, are you all right?" The question was so simple and so direct, and so far outside the parameters of anything she had been asked in the last 6 months of high-stakes business management, that it arrived somewhere completely unprotected. "I'm fine," she said. And then, because that was no longer enough and she was tired of it, "I'm better than I've been in years, actually." Which is the most disorienting thing I can say, given that I'm currently helping build a territorial legal case against a land speculator in Wyoming. Grant was very still for a moment. Then he said, quietly and directly, the way he said everything, "I'm glad you're here." "So am I," Virginia said, which was the most she had ever admitted to anyone, and which she said looking directly at him, so there was no ambiguity about what she meant by it. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not like a storm breaking, but more like a window being opened that had been shut for a long time, the air coming through different and cleaner than what had been in the room before. Grant filed the documentation with the Territorial Land Office the following week. The review of Crane's filings was opened within 10 days. 3 other ranchers in the territory, recognizing that their own situations with Crane were relevant to the review, added their documentation to the record. The Territorial Attorney General's office became involved by the end of August. Dillard Crane did not respond the way Virginia had expected. He should have retreated or negotiated or worked through his lawyer. Instead, on a Tuesday in September, he rode into town with 2 men and found Grant behind the livery. She had been at the Mercantile collecting a supply order when she heard the commotion. She came around the corner of the building and saw the situation she had interrupted. Grant on the ground with a gash on his cheek and Dillard Crane standing over him with a gun, and two large men positioned to prevent anyone from intervening. She had called his name before she knew she was going to. Which brought her back to exactly where the story had begun, standing at the corner of the mercantile with Dillard Crane's pale eyes on her, and the absolute certainty that she had just handed him a weapon she had spent months trying to make sure he would never have. She had given herself away. He knew she cared about Grant Archer. He could use that. For approximately 4 seconds, Virginia Garner experienced pure fear. Then she looked at Grant. He was looking at her with that silent, furious please-run expression, and under it, visible only because she had spent 7 months learning to read him, was something else. Trust. He trusted her to handle this the way she handled everything, not with what looked like strength from the outside, but with the clear-eyed intelligence that had dismantled Dillard Crane's legal strategy piece by piece over the past 3 months. She took a breath. She thought about the Territorial Attorney General's office. She thought about the 3 other ranchers who had added their documentation to the review. She thought about the letter she had left on her desk that morning, sealed and addressed to the Laramie marshal, which she had prepared precisely because she had not trusted Crane to behave predictably when the review began. She had given it to Porter before she left for the mercantile. She had told him to deliver it if she was not back in 2 hours. She had been gone almost 2 hours. "Mr. Crane," Virginia said, her voice completely steady, "I think you should understand what you're doing right now." "I understand fine," Crane said. "You're assaulting a man in the street in front of witnesses," Virginia said. "While the Territorial Attorney General's office is actively reviewing your land filings. You have built a very careful operation over 4 years, and you are about to destroy it yourself in the next 5 minutes out of anger. Is that really the calculation you want to make?" Crane stared at her. One of the witnesses she had mentioned, a man coming out of the feed store across the street, had stopped and was watching. A woman further down the street had also stopped. "The marshal is going to be here in a few minutes," Virginia said. She did not know this for certain. She was calculating on Porter. "I sent word before I came around this corner. You can still ride out of here before he arrives, which is a better outcome for you than the one that happens if you're holding that gun when he does." Crane was quiet for a moment. His gun had not moved from Grant's direction, but his eyes were moving, reading the street, doing the same kind of calculation Virginia had just described. She could see him doing it. The witnesses, the open street, the Attorney General review already in motion. "This isn't over," Crane said. "No," Virginia agreed. "But how it's over will be determined by what you do in the next 30 seconds. Crane held her gaze for a long moment. Then he lowered the gun. He put it away with a precise, controlled movement that cost him something. She could see it costing him. The relinquishment of a man who had planned this and was now retreating from it. He looked at Grant, still on the ground. "This land will not be yours forever," he said. "Get off," Grant said. His voice was perfectly level. Crane turned, remounted his horse, and left with his 2 men at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried, because a man like Crane would not be seen to flee. Virginia watched him go until he was around the corner and out of sight. Then her knees tried to fail her, and she did not let them. She crossed the street to where Grant was getting to his feet, the gash on his cheek still seeping. She put her hand out on pure reflex, steadying his arm as he stood, and he caught her hand with his and held it for a moment before she pulled it back. "You all right?" she said. Her voice had finally lost some of its steadiness. "Fine," Grant said. His eyes were on her face. "You told him the marshal was coming." "Yes." "Was that true?" "I gave Porter a letter for the marshal this morning," Virginia said. "I told him to deliver it if I wasn't back in 2 hours. That was about 2 hours ago, so it's approximately true." Grant looked at her for a long moment. The blood was still drying on his cheek. The witnesses from the street had gathered closer now, and someone was already heading toward the marshal's office, so it appeared the marshal was genuinely going to arrive shortly regardless of Porter. "Virginia," Grant said, "you need that cheek cleaned," she said. "And then we need to go to the marshal together and give a full account before Crane's version gets there first." "Virginia," he said again, more quietly. She stopped. She looked at him. She was still slightly shaking, which she was angry about, and he could see it, which was worse. "Thank you," he said. She had heard him say those words before, over good work, over useful analysis, over contracts well managed. He said them differently now. He said them the way you say something that covers more ground than the words can contain. "You're welcome," she said. She kept her voice very level. And then, because she was done managing the distance and had been done with it for longer than she had admitted, "Don't ever do anything stupid enough to put yourself in that position again. I don't particularly want to experience that a second time." He almost smiled. Then he actually smiled, not the small brief movement at the corner of his mouth, but a full, real, open smile that changed his face entirely. And Virginia looked at it and felt the last of her carefully constructed resistance collapse like a fence in a Wyoming winter, quietly and completely, and without any hope of immediate repair. The marshal arrived. They gave their account. 3 witnesses corroborated the assault. A warrant was issued for Dillard Crane's arrest on the charges of criminal menace and assault, which, combined with the Territorial Attorney General's review of his land filings, put his entire operation in serious legal jeopardy. Crane left the territory by the end of the month. His attorney, Sykes, facing his own exposure in the filing fraud, negotiated a settlement that invalidated 4 of Crane's territorial claims, including the option on Grant's water rights. The water rights were filed properly and transferred to Archer Cattle Company before October. Ruth told Virginia, with the cheerful bluntness of someone who had been waiting for this specific conversation for several months, that she had known since April how things were going to go between her and Grant, and had simply been waiting for the 2 of them to catch up with the obvious. "Was it that clear?" Virginia said. "Only to everyone with eyes," Ruth said. She poured coffee and pushed the cup across the table. "He's a patient man, probably the most patient man I've worked for, but even patient men eventually need to know where they stand." Virginia looked at her coffee. "I'm not particularly practiced at this," Virginia said, which was the most direct thing she had said to anyone about it, and she said it to Ruth because Ruth was the safest person to say it to, and also because she had learned that Ruth's directness was never unkind. "Nobody is," Ruth said. "Doesn't stop them." That evening, Virginia went looking for Grant rather than waiting for the walk along the fence line that had become their habit. She found him in the barn doing the last of the evening chores, moving with the steady, unhurried thoroughness he brought to physical work, and she came in out of the early October cold and stood in the warm smell of horses and hay and said, without preamble, because she had decided that preamble was not the right approach, "I want to say something to you, and I need you to let me say it without interrupting." Grant turned around from the stall he was working on. He looked at her with that particular quality of attention that was only ever for things that genuinely mattered to him. "All right," he said. "I came west because I needed to start a life that I built myself," Virginia said. "I came west because every door in Cincinnati was closed to me for reasons that had nothing to do with my actual ability to walk through them. I came west because I believed, and I still believe, that I am capable of building something on my own without requiring anyone to carry any part of it for me." She paused. Grant was utterly still. "I came west to work," Virginia said, "not to be cared for. And you have done both of those things from almost the first day I arrived, and you have done them in a way that never once made me feel that the work was less than the care, or that the care was conditional on anything I said or did, or that you were expecting anything from me in return for either of them. And I have spent 6 months being extremely inconvenienced by that, because it did not fit the arrangement I had made with myself about what my life was going to look like." Grant said nothing. His expression was the quietest she had ever seen it. "I am not inconvenienced by it any more," Virginia said. "I am quite done being inconvenienced by it, and I think you should know that." A moment of complete silence, the kind that has weight and warmth in it. "Virginia," Grant said, "I said don't interrupt." "You stopped talking," he pointed out. "I was pausing. It looked like you were finished." I was gathering myself, Virginia said, and then she stopped pretending she was going to say anything else useful and looked at him directly with every bit of the clarity she brought to her best work. I love you, she said. I am not comfortable with how much, and I imagine I will spend some amount of time continuing to be difficult about it. But that is the truth, and it seemed important to say it plainly. Grant crossed the barn in 3 long steps and took both of her hands in his, and she let him, and he looked at her face with an expression that was open and steady and certain in the way he was certain about things that were genuinely, durably true. I have loved you since April, he said. When you found Fletcher's discrepancy in the first week and brought it to me with every entry marked and a plan for fixing it, and you said, "What do you recommend?" back to me when I asked you, and you looked like someone who had never been asked that before and wasn't sure yet whether to trust it. Virginia absorbed this. That was 3 weeks after I arrived, she said. Yes, Grant said. You waited 6 months. You needed time, Grant said simply, and I was not going to rush you past anything you needed. She looked at him. She thought about the plates of food and the replaced chair and the book in the hallway and every walk along the fence line and every evening over the desk and the way he had consistently stopped at the edge of her comfort and waited without complaint, because he understood without her telling him that she needed to arrive at her own conclusions in her own time. She stepped forward and kissed him, because she was a woman who had learned to take action when the analysis was clear, and the analysis had never been clearer. He kissed her back with a warmth and steadiness that was exactly what she should have known it would be, given who he was, and she held onto the front of his coat with both hands and felt the particular quality of coming home that she had not expected to find in Wyoming or anywhere else, because she had not known it was something she was missing. The night had a frost to it, but they stood in the warm barn doorway for a very long time. The winter of 1883 settled over the ranch with the serious, white-faced gravity of Wyoming winters, and it was during those long, snow-closed evenings that Virginia discovered the full landscape of what it was to be with someone like Grant Archer. He was not effusive. He was not given to large, romantic performances. He loved with a consistency and an attentiveness that was quiet and deep and entirely unlike anything she had experienced before, and she found it, after some initial adjustment on the part of her deeply independent nature, more sustaining than she had imagined sustained attention from another person could be. They were formal about it, because they were formal people, and because Ruth was present in the house, and the ranch hands had their own sense of things. But the nature of the shift between them was not invisible to anyone paying attention, and Ruth's particular brand of cheerful discretion ensured that the household moved around this new reality with a certain comfortable tact. Grant asked Virginia to marry him in January of 1884, on a Sunday evening when the snow was coming down thick outside the windows, and a fire was going in the sitting room, and they had been reading in adjacent chairs for 2 hours in the way they often spent Sunday evenings, peacefully occupied in the same space without needing to fill it with words. He put down his book and said, without theatrical preparation, "I'd like to marry you, Virginia, if that's something you want." Virginia kept her book open for a moment, looking at the page she was no longer reading. Then she looked at him. "You're certain," she said, "not a question, a clarification." "As certain as I've been of anything," Grant said. "You know I'm not going to stop working," Virginia said. "The books are mine. The contracts and the correspondences and the filing system I've built, those are mine. I'm not going to hand them to some other bookkeeper because it looks more appropriate." "I know," Grant said. "I'd consider it a serious professional setback if you did." The warmth in his voice was entirely unperformative. Virginia closed her book. "Yes," she said, "I want to marry you." They were married in Laramie in February 1884, a simple ceremony at the Presbyterian Church with Ruth as witness, and 2 of the neighboring ranchers whose documentation had contributed to the Crane investigation as additional guests. Virginia wore a dark blue dress she had ordered from the seamstress in town, wool and practical for February, and she carried herself at the altar with the composed, clear-eyed certainty she brought to everything she decided. Grant looked at her throughout the ceremony with the steady, honest attention that she had come to understand was his particular form of devotion, the kind that did not require an audience and never faded when the occasion did. Afterward, Ruth made dinner at the ranch, and the neighboring ranchers' wives came and brought food, and the evening was warm and full of people who had lived hard in the same difficult country and found occasion to celebrate in it, which felt right in a way that large ceremonies would not have. Virginia Garner became Virginia Archer in the church ledger and remained Virginia Garner Archer in her own mind, which she told Grant on the drive back to the ranch. "Both names," Grant said. "Both names," Virginia confirmed. "I earned mine." "You did," Grant said, and meant it. Spring came again, the violent Wyoming spring, and with it the full weight of the cattle season and the expanded operations that the secured water rights had made possible. Virginia took on a part-time assistant, a quiet young woman named Clara who was working to save money to send for her mother from Missouri, and Virginia trained her with the same methodical care that she had learned over the past year was the way you invested properly in people who were capable. She also expanded the filing system to include a new archive for territorial legal correspondence, because the Crane case had demonstrated that such correspondence was not a one-time emergency, but a permanent feature of doing business in the territory, and she would rather be prepared for the next version of it than caught again without documentation. She was also, by that spring, quietly aware that the composition of the household was likely to change. She told Grant in May, sitting in the office at the end of a working day, because the office felt like the right place for an announcement of significance, given that the office was where their partnership had first been established. She said it directly, because she had not learned any other way to say important things. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had never seen before, entirely open and soft and something beyond happy, a word she was not sure was large enough. He stood up from the second chair and came around to her side of the desk and took both of her hands in his with a gentleness that was different from every other kind of gentleness he had ever shown her, more careful, as if something had suddenly become both precious and fragile. He did not say anything immediately. He pressed her hands between his and looked at her with that particular quality she had learned over the past year meant something was important enough to him that words felt insufficient. "Virginia," he finally said. "We're going to need a larger filing system," she said, because humor was how she handled things that moved her more than she was fully prepared for. Grant laughed, a real one, warm and full. He pulled her up from the chair and held her in the way he did sometimes, her head against his shoulder and his arms steady around her, the most uncomplicated and honest comfort she had ever found in another person, and she let herself be held in it without making any effort to pull back. Their son was born in November of 1884, a healthy, insistent boy they named Thomas, after no one in particular, and because the name felt solid and unadorned and fit the general aesthetic they applied to most things. He was loud and vigorous from the first hour, and showed an early and inconvenient interest in the contents of his mother's filing drawers, which Virginia addressed with the same organized patience she brought to all problems, building him a separate set of non-essential papers to reorganize to his heart's content. Ruth, who had delivered babies in Wyoming for 20 years, including at a significantly less comfortable location than the main house of a well-equipped cattle ranch, managed the whole process with the calm authority of someone who had seen everything and remained troubled by very little. Grant, who had been extraordinarily composed through every business crisis of the previous 18 months, was considerably less composed during the actual delivery, which Virginia found both predictable and endearing, and told him so afterward, while he was sitting in the chair by the bed looking as if he had recently survived something significant. "You were the one doing the work," Grant said. "Yes," Virginia agreed. "You were very pale." "I was concerned," Grant said with dignity. "I know," she said. She reached over and took his hand, and he held it, and they both looked at their son, who had gone to sleep with the sudden completeness of the very young. The years built on themselves the way the good ones do, not without difficulty, but with the particular quality of a life being properly lived. The cattle operation expanded. The territorial legal climate stabilized significantly after Crane's departure, and the subsequent reforms to the land filing process. Reforms that Virginia had contributed to in a small but direct way through her documentation. The Attorney General's office had, in correspondence with the territorial legislature, cited the Crane case as a specific example of the filing fraud they were addressing, and had referenced the documentation package provided by Virginia Garner Archer of Laramie in a way that was professional and dry, and which Virginia found deeply satisfying in the way she found all accurately credited work satisfying. Clara, the assistant she had trained, married one of the seasonal hands in 1885 and eventually opened her own bookkeeping practice in Laramie. Virginia was her first reference, and wrote the letter with the focused enthusiasm she reserved for things she was genuinely proud of. Ruth stayed. She was part of the household in the way certain people become permanently part of the structures they help to hold together, and Virginia was not sure she could have imagined the ranch without her. Ruth taught Thomas to identify every bird in the valley by the time he was 4, information that Thomas dispensed at length and on all available occasions, to the general delight of everyone except the hands who were trying to work while being lectured about meadowlarks. Their daughter came in 1887, arriving in the spring with the same vigorous impatience as her brother, and they named her Margaret. She was red-headed, which Grant took as a personal surprise, though there was apparently a red-headed grandmother somewhere in Virginia's family history that provided the explanation. And she was from infancy, the most determined person in a household that already contained 2 extremely determined people, and had never quite recovered its previous equilibrium from the addition of Thomas. Margaret walked early and talked early, and at 2 years old had developed a system for organizing her toys by size, color, and an additional category that she understood, but that no one else could quite determine. Virginia observed this with the private certainty that the bookkeeping was secure for at least another generation. Grant watched his children with the same attentive steadiness he brought to everything he loved, present and patient, and genuinely interested in who they were becoming. He read to them in the evenings, the same books Virginia had argued with him about on their walks, and Thomas developed strong opinions about geology and Margaret developed strong opinions about everything else. And the house on winter evenings was the kind of full and warm that Virginia had not let herself want for years before she had learned that wanting it was not a weakness. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stepped off the train at Laramie in March of 1883, spine straight and face composed, and every possible guard in place. She thought about the careful, deliberate solitude she had built around herself, and how completely certain she had been that it was what she needed. She did not think she had been wrong about what she had needed at that time. She had needed specifically to prove to herself and everyone who had ever looked past her that she was fully and entirely capable. She had come west to do that, and she had done it. She had also found something she had not been looking for and had spent considerable energy resisting, and she had eventually been smart enough and brave enough to stop. Grant had understood, without being told and without making an issue of it, that she had come west to work and not to be managed or diminished or folded into someone else's life. He had given her the work, all of it, with the seriousness it deserved. And he had also, quietly and without asking anything in return, cared for her in the particular way that was most difficult for her to receive, the daily, consistent, unceremonious kind that did not make a performance of itself but was simply there, in plates of food and replaced chairs and books left in hallways, and every evening spent on the right side of a fence line. He had done both without asking her to choose between them. That was the remarkable thing. That had always been the remarkable thing. One evening in the autumn of 1888, Virginia came into the sitting room to find Grant at the desk she had moved from the office into the house several years ago, when their working collaboration had evolved to the point where it was easier to simply merge the workspace with the living space, which had involved a domestic negotiation. She had won on the grounds that the filing system required adequate proximity to the person doing the filing. Thomas was asleep upstairs. Margaret had gone to sleep early after an afternoon of exceptional energy that had involved a project with the chicken yard that no one had fully understood, but which had evidently been satisfying to its creator. The house was quiet in the way it got after the children slept, a different quality of quiet than the childless quiet, warmer and more temporary. Grant looked up from whatever he was reading, and she came over and sat on the edge of the desk the way she sometimes did when she wanted to talk without the formality of sitting across from him, and he turned in the chair to face her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. He had learned to ask this rather than waiting, because Virginia's thinking face and Virginia's neutral face were identical to anyone who didn't know her, and after 5 years he knew her. "I'm thinking about the advertisement," Virginia said. "The one in the Cincinnati paper. Wanted bookkeeper and general ledger manager," Grant smiled. "One of my better decisions," he said. "You didn't specify gender," Virginia said. "I told you it wasn't relevant. Most men would have made it relevant." "I wasn't interested in most," Grant said. Virginia looked at him. The oil lamp on the desk made the room warm-lit, and outside the first frost of autumn had come down, and she could hear the wind the way she had learned over 5 Wyoming years to hear it, like a long conversation the land was having with itself. "I was so certain," she said. "When I came out here, I had the whole thing decided. Who I was going to be and how I was going to be it and what I was not going to let myself need." "I know," Grant said. "I could see it when you got off the train. Was I very obvious?" "You were very clear," he said. "There's a difference. Obvious suggests you didn't know what you were doing. You knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't know yet that the plan had a revision coming." Virginia looked at the ledger open on the desk. The numbers were current as they always were. Outside, one of the horses in the barn shifted and settled. Thomas would be up early to tell everyone what specific type of bird he had seen out the north window. Margaret would have reorganized something by morning. "Grant," Virginia said. "Yes. I'm glad I didn't find what I expected when I came west," she said. "I'm glad I found what I wasn't looking for instead." He reached up and took her hand the same way he had that first time in the barn, careful and certain. "So am I," he said, "every single day." She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his for a moment, a gesture that was entirely private and theirs, something they had arrived at over years without ever deciding to, and felt the completeness of a life that had turned out bigger and better, and more full than anything the woman on the train platform in 1883 had let herself imagine. She had come west to work. She had worked and done it well and built something real and lasting from her own capability and intelligence. She had not come west to be cared for, and she had found that distinction did not have to be a barrier, because being cared for and being capable were not opposites. They had never been opposites. She had just needed, for a while, to live far enough from the world that had told her otherwise before she could believe it. Grant Archer had understood that. He had given her both, the work and the care, without being asked, without conditions, without ever requiring her to be less in order to receive more. The fire burned. The children slept. The Wyoming wind moved through the dark outside, and the mountains held their ground under the stars, as they always had, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the smaller urgencies of human plans. Virginia Garner Archer sat on the edge of her desk in the house that had become hers, held her husband's hand, and was, without ambiguity or reservation or a single remaining guard in place, completely and durably happy. It was, she thought, considerably better than what she had planned. It was, in fact, the best revision she had ever made.